The Impossible State. Islam, Politics, and Modernity's Moral Predicament. Wael B. Hallaq. Preface and Acknowledgements. Although the greater part of this book was written during 2011, it has been in the making for at least a decade. It formed part of the preparation necessary to write my Sharia Theory, Practice, Transformations, published by Cambridge University Press in 2009. The plan and structure of Sharia did not allow for a full, or at least fuller, statement about the modern state and the reasons for and meanings of its incompatibility with the Sharia. The present book may therefore be regarded as a continuation of and expansion upon Sharia's interest in the state, in both empirical substance and theoretical direction. In terms of substance, it is clear that much more needed to be said about the modern state in the 2009 book that could not be included in an already very long work. In terms of direction, by which I mean teasing out the wider theoretical implications of the empirical narrative of so-called Islamic law and its governance, Sharia was largely silent. The present work attempts to fill this gap and in the process engage the Western disciplines of political science, moral philosophy, and law. In thinking about the themes of this book, I have benefited from the intellectual companionship of a number of individuals. My graduate students and former colleagues at McGill University have for years afforded me the luxury of engagement in first-rate conversations about the modern state and much else. At Columbia, my department's fortnightly colloquium and other extensive conversations with colleagues have continued this engagement, providing me with much insight that resulted in sharpening the text. I am grateful to Talal Asad's and Sudipta Kaviraj's always fruitful intellectual companionship. To Akil Bilgrami and Kaukab Chibaro for insightful remarks they made on the second part of Chapter 5. To Mahmoud Mamdani's observations on Chapter 3. To Abid Awad's useful critique of the entire manuscript, but most especially of Chapter 3, which benefited greatly from his comments. And last but certainly not least to Muhammad Qasim Zaman, for reading and perspicaciously and constructively commenting on the entire text. I am also grateful to my gifted and efficient research assistants, Maura Donovan, Sean Higgins, Eelfi Startuff, and Elizabeth Ragibi. Stephen Millier of McGill continues to make what I write appear more elegant. To all these individuals and to others I may have neglected to mention, I record here my profound gratitude. Introduction. The argument of this book is fairly simple. The Islamic State, judged by any standard definition of what the modern state represents, is both an impossibility and a contradiction in terms. Until the early 19th century, and for 12 centuries before then, the moral law of Islam, the Sharia, had successfully negotiated customary law and local customary practices and had emerged as the supreme moral and legal force regulating both society and government. This law was paradigmatic, having been accepted as a central system of high and general norms by societies and the dynastic powers that ruled over them. It was a moral law that created and maintained a well-ordered society, to borrow John Rawls's effective expression. However, beginning in the 19th century, and at the hands of colonialist Europe, the socio-economic and political system regulated by the Sharia was structurally dismantled. Which is to say that the Sharia itself was eviscerated, reduced to providing no more than the raw materials for the legislation of personal status by the modern state. Even in this relatively limited sphere, the Sharia lost its autonomy and social agency in favor of the modern state. Sharia was henceforth needed only to the limited extent that deriving certain provisions from it. Provisions that were reworked and recreated according to modern expediency, legitimized the state's legislative ventures. For the great majority of Muslims today, the Sharia undoubtedly remains a source of religious and moral authority. Whereas some Islamic regimes have adopted the policy of distilling from the Sharia, while flagrantly disregarding both its procedural laws and communal context. Such punishments as dismemberment and stoning, the average Muslim individual continues to find in the Sharia a spiritual resource, a connection with God, and a way to discipline the inner self. what we discuss later under the rubric of technologies of the self. To say that the overwhelming majority of modern Muslims wish for the Sharia to return in one form or another is to state what anyone with even a cursory knowledge of world affairs would readily acknowledge. The question of why they entertain this wish will be answered in good part in the following chapters, although this is not an intended objective of this book. Yet, as located in the modern condition, this wish entails an aporia. Muslims today, including their leading intellectuals, have come to take the modern state for granted, accepting it as a natural reality. They often assume it not only to have existed throughout the long course of their history but also to have been sanctioned by no less an authority than the Quran itself. Even nationalism, an unprecedented phenomenon and one uniquely constitutive of the modern state, is said to have been launched into the world by the Islamic Holy Constitution similarly drafted in Medina 14 centuries ago. Early Islamic societies are also viewed as having developed the concepts of citizenship, democracy, and suffrage. Unlike some globalization theorists and political scientists who call into question the future durability of the state, modern Islamist thinkers and scholars take the modern state for granted and, in effect, as a timeless phenomenon, this being partly a reflection of a present reality in which they must confront what seems to them to be an indestructible and powerful machine on a daily basis. Modern Muslims are therefore faced with the challenge of reconciling two facts. First, the ontological fact of the state and its undeniably powerful presence, and, second, the deontological fact of the necessity to bring about a form of Sharia governance. This challenge is further complicated by the recognition that the state in Muslim countries has not done much to rehabilitate any acceptable form of genuine Sharia governance. The constitutional battles of the Islamists in Egypt and Pakistan, the failures of the Iranian Revolution as an Islamic political and legal project, and other similar disappointments amply testify to this proposition. Yet the state remains the favored template of the Islamists and the ulama, so-called Muslim clergymen. In a recent and highly representative statement, the powerful Muslim Brothers argue that the modern nation-state does not stand in contradiction with the implementation of Islamic Sharia, because Islam is the highest authority in Muslim lands, or so it should be. With its mechanisms, regulations, laws, and systems, the modern state, if it contains no contradiction to the founding and indubitable principles of Islam, does not preclude the possibility of being developed, so that we can benefit from it in achieving for ourselves progress and advancement. Note that developed here should be taken to mean adapted to our needs and purposes, as the text makes clear later. Any attempt by the nation-state to quarantine religion or undermine commitment to the supreme authority of Islam will no doubt be rejected by any Muslim. Thus, the state is expected to promote Islamic values, including general public interest, the rule of law, freedom, and equal opportunity for all citizens, and to deepen the conception of citizenship. In our understanding of what Islam means, these are the tasks that the modern state should accomplish. A subtitle in the document sums it up. There is no contradiction between the nation-state and Islamic Sharia. But surely there is. The argument of this book, as we have already intimated, is that any conception of a modern Islamic state is inherently self-contradictory. We must remember that Muslims today constitute nearly 1/5 of the world's population and that inasmuch as they live in modernity, they also live the modern project. They are as much a part of this project as anyone else. It is the argument of this book that the inherent self-contradictions entailed by a modern Islamic state are primarily grounded in modernity's moral predicament. The political and the economic, however integral to the self-contradiction, remain derivative of this moral predicament, which is to say that resolving these contradictions as moral issues would by definition resolve the political and economic problems. To state the matter even more explicitly, the inherent contradictions of any conception of a modern Muslim state, by virtue of the formidable vertical effect and horizontal power of the modern state, capture not only the entire spectrum of what has been described as the crisis of modern Islam but also implicate the moral dimensions of the modern project in our world from beginning to end. This book, therefore, is an essay in moral thought even more so than it is a commentary on politics or law. In order to elaborate our argument, we must first arrive at descriptions of what we shall call paradigmatic Islamic governance and the paradigmatic modern state, these being the preoccupation of chapters 1 and 2, respectively. However, chapter 1 also delineates the conception of paradigm as we use it here, a conception central to our overall argument. And since this argument will fly in the face of many modernist assumptions about law, politics, morality, and the meaning of the good life, we must also address the ideology inhabiting, nay, dominating, our thinking about modernity and the achievements of the modern project. We must therefore call into question the latent and not so latent conceptual assumptions undergirding modern discourse. Namely, the rhetorical and substantive discourse of the modern theory of progress. On the other hand, while recognizing synchronic changes and diachronic variants in the makeup of the modern state, Chapter 2 attempts to identify what we will call form properties that, for our purposes, represent the essential qualities of this state. Interdependent in their constitution and effects, these form properties will be disentangled for analytical purposes. The ideas of sovereign will and the rule of law will be examined in Chapter 3 in terms of the doctrine and practice of separation of powers, an examination that serves two purposes. First, it will allow us to set forth the constitutional frameworks and structures of both the modern state and Islamic governance. Since these are the larger contexts in which law, the legal system, government, and politics are deemed to operate. In other words, this will serve to outline the constitutional backgrounds and boundaries of the two systems. The second and simultaneous purpose, on the other hand, will be to highlight the constitutional differences between these two systems of governance. Differences that will permit a further exploration, in Chapter 4, of the meaning of law and its relationship to morality. This largely philosophical account, underscoring the qualitative differences between the legal conception of the modern state and that of Islamic governance, will turn political in the second part of the chapter. Here, the legal-moral differentials identified in the first part will be augmented by political differentials that will reveal yet another sphere of incompatibility. Chapter 5 narrows the focus of Chapter 4, moving from the macro to the micro levels, from systems of thought and of politics to the realms of self and subjectivity. Chapter 5 argues that the modern nation-state and Islamic governance tend to produce, by their very nature and by virtue of the technologies of the self that both inherently possess, two different fields of subjectivity formation. Again, the subjects produced by these paradigmatic fields stand at great variance with each other, engendering two different types of moral, political, epistemic, and psychosocial conceptions of the world. These profound differences between the subjects of the modern nation-state and those of Islamic governance merely represent the microcosmic manifestations of the macrocosmic differences that are material, structural, constitutional, and, just as importantly, philosophical and conceptual. In Chapter 6 we concede, for the sake of argument, that against all odds and despite staggering impediments, a form of Islamic governance comes into existence. We then argue that modern forms of globalization and the position of the state in the ever-increasing intensity of these forms are sufficient to render any brand of Islamic governance either impossible or, if possible, incapable of survival in the long run. However, the aggregate implications of this and earlier arguments in the foregoing chapters are clear. All things considered, Islamic governance is unsustainable, given the conditions prevailing in the modern world. Capitalizing on the concept of paradigm and central domain, we move in the final chapter to the interrogation of modern moral dilemmas, pointing to their structural conceptual foundations as constituting the root of the moral predicaments that modernity, in all its Eastern and Western forms, has been encountering. We insist that if the impossibility of Islamic governance in the modern world is directly the result of the lack of an auspicious moral environment that can meet the minimal standards and expectations of this governance, then it is imperative to connect this morally based impossibility with the wider problematic contexts that modernity's moral difficulties have engendered. Hence, we argue that this impossibility is merely another manifestation and a constant companion of a number of other problems, not the least of which is the increasing collapse of organic social units, the rise of oppressive economic forms, and, most importantly, the havoc wrought against the natural habitat and the environment. All these are seen in this book as philosophical, moral and epistemic issues as much as they are material and physical. Indeed, looking closely at the internal moral critiques within Western postmodernity, we find close parallels, even a virtual identity, between them and the latent meanings of the modern Muslim call for the establishment of Islamic governance. This book has been written with a view to making its language and arguments accessible to as wide an audience as possible, beyond specialists in law, politics, and philosophy. Much of its subject matter about Islam has been simplified and stripped of most technical detail, though without allowing the discussion to descend to the simplistic. In order to avoid the latter at any cost, I found it necessary to assume, at many points throughout the book, a certain body of knowledge without which we would not be able to proceed in expounding our arguments. Because such knowledge is necessary for an adequate appreciation of the latter, I have adopted the practice of providing various accounts of knowledge in those places in the book where they are absolutely essential and most relevant, and have then referred the reader to these. During other discussions where they are necessary, even indispensable, as background information. Needless to stress, then, that these cross-references are not to be seen as merely a convention of scholarly writing but as essential tools providing the necessary amount of knowledge for each of our arguments to be properly appreciated and assessed. However, an alternative to this cross-referenced approach would be to digest my earlier writings, especially Sharia history, theory, and practice, or, less preferably, the much shorter Introduction to Islamic Law. Finally, a word of caution. Despite the extensive and detailed historical narrative proffered throughout the following chapters, this book is not merely a history of Islamic law. While it represents no significant departure from the substance of narrative I have expounded in Sharia Introduction and elsewhere, it does adopt a distinctive narrative form. Which is to say that while it acknowledges and accounts for diversity, messiness, and violations in Sharia's long history, it capitalizes on the concept of paradigm in order to retrieve, from a paradigmatic structure, the moral dimension that nonetheless pervades these complex and messy realia.